Thank you, Bruce, for those very kind words. Well, I'm very honored to have been asked to introduce our speaker for this evening. Now, Paul Carroll grew up in Goderich, Ontario, and being a lake port just like Collingwood, when you grow up in a lake port, you're always interested in boats, shipping, and the Great Lakes. It just, you can't help it. It's part of being in a Great Lakes port community. So the Wexford and the Great Storm of 1913 had been thoroughly researched by Paul, who also was a part of the team that was searching Lake Huron for the sunken ship, the Wexford. But I should let Paul tell you the rest of his story, so it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our noted author, historian, and our special guest, Mr. Paul Carroll.
Thank you. Let me test and see if this thing is working. Is this working? Yeah. Great. Okay. After a long, blustery, rain-swept drive, we made it. And we had a fantastic quick supper down the street at, I've forgotten the name. No, somebody else was here. There were two others that were at that restaurant with all the paintings just down.
The Tremont?
No, doesn't matter. There are two people in this room that were there with us, but they didn't know we were there. Anyway, let me start off and get the propaganda out of the road quickly and get on with my presentation. There are a number of things in the room that may be of interest to you. Here, Julie, hold that, will you? There is a card at the back on the back table that has a full listing of everything our Great Lakes Storm of 1913 Centenary Committee has done, from Port Huron to Tobermory and Manitoulin Island, and some of those events are happening now between now and November the 10th. Please pick one up. If you don't get one, there's a downloadable one page at our website, which is 1913storm.ca. If you want the quick overview, there are also some of those cards available at the back, and if you want to know more about what we're doing for secondary school students in particular, those who might be leaning towards career choices on the water, there's one of those cards as well. We have a fantastic amount of stuff going on, and it's driving me crazy, and my wife especially, who is now described as a Great Storm widow. All over the front table are books. I hope that you may take some home with you. Being an author is not a moneymaker, let me tell you. There's a freebie. It's the Town of Goderich Visitor Guide, and it has 2 or 3 pages about the Great Storm in it. I have about 25 or 30 copies. Feel free to take these. They're easy to identify. They've got the Great Fall scene on the front and the little Great Lakes Storm logo down on the bottom. They're on the table. We also have some postcards that are relevant to an incident I may get to showing you on the screen. And I know there are some people in the audience here we need to talk about and have come forward as we go through the evening. My object is to educate, to inform, hopefully in a manner that will keep you awake and be a little bit entertaining. I'll do my best, and we'll just go from there. The first thing I want to acknowledge is that we have a lot of sponsors for our undertaking for this centenary. And as of this afternoon, the budget that we're spending just passed $111,000. So we're doing it, and we're doing it right. And they will not forget about the Great Storm if you connect with us. I am shocked at the number of people who still don't know anything about it. And I will not stop with my passion until as many people as with whom I can connect between now and the final events on November the 10th know about this great maritime disaster, the greatest and most tragic ever recorded in our Great Lakes history. We've been sponsored by everybody from Canada through Ontario to the Goderich Port Management Corporation, who had enough confidence to get us going about 2 years ago and gave us $10,000 in seed money, because they also saw the potential for a grand remembrance, which is in fact unfolding. And we're conducting activities not only on the Canadian side of the Lake Huron shores, but also on the American side, working in partnership with the Port Huron Museum and a number of affiliates connected with them as far south as Detroit. I had to turn down a speaking request for the Wisconsin Marine Historical Society because Milwaukee's just too far to drive. But they're in it too. So this is a Great Lakes adventure and a venture of remembrance all the way around the Great Lakes Basin. If you were in Goderich, you might see banners like this around about. They are 40 feet tall, and they are to represent the extremes of the so-called height of the waves during this tempest. And they are certainly a good visual connection to help you understand how drastic it was. You will also see in other locations numerous times the rendering of the Wexford, which appears on the front of my book, done by a very famed Canadian maritime artist who lives in Tobermory now, Captain Charles Bud Robinson, a personal friend of Mary and me, who did the painting that we're using on most of our literature, and the painting is on the front of the book. You'll see it later. We're also sharing with Port Huron their logo, which you see on the bottom half there, and it is to help present the image and the vision of the Great Storm remembered all the way around Lake Huron and down through Detroit. We are using it, for example, on flags all the way along the highway, beginning at the Blue Water Bridge and ending at South Bay Mouth in Tobermory. We have a flag placed at almost every location where something significant happened offshore on Lake Huron or inshore here off Georgian Bay on the 3-day period of the storm, November 8th, 9th, and 10th, in particular, 1913. Do visit our website, please. It has a great collection of information, and follow us on Facebook and find out what's going on. There have been hundreds and hundreds of postings, mostly with pictures and some fascinating stories that are related to the Great Storm. And I don't have time to even touch on any of that tonight. What I want to do for you is focus mainly on the Wexford, because that's where my heart has been and my passion has been for at least 20 years. And I also want to indicate right off the top that history books are never correct. When I wrote this book, a good friend of mine said, "Paul, when you shake the tree, the cherries will fall." And if there were to be a second edition, I would make 55 to 60 changes and additions to this book. When I wrote the commemorative book about the Great Storm, this one, which was released in June, I felt the same way. The cherries did start to fall. And so far we've identified about 15 corrections. And they're not necessarily my corrections, or corrections to my errors, but corrections to history as it has been told and retold through the generations. Some of them starting with the Lake Carriers Association reported the storm in early 1914. They just got it wrong. The Wexford did not go down carrying steel rails, which is repeated and repeated and repeated, especially in the American literature. It went down carrying a load of grain. The owner said at the inquest it never carried steel rails in its life. The leaf field that went down on Lake Superior went down carrying a load of steel rails, at least partly loaded with steel rails. So that's the kind of thing we have corrected in this issue. If you buy one of these or have one of these, and you want to keep right up to date with the errata, we have published a downloadable errata page that you can get from our internet site so that you can keep your book absolutely accurate. I think we're pushing 99.9% on this one. Those books, by the way, also have an audio tape, or an audio CD, pardon me, that dates me, doesn't it? An audio CD, which is a dialogue about those special points along Highway 21, running from Sarnia through to Tobermory, and all of the things that happened on both sides, on the lakeside and on both sides of the Bruce Peninsula. So here we go. I also want to talk about the Great Storm. I want to begin with something that I still find difficult to talk about. And it happened last Saturday, and it was at the site of the Wexford wreck. And we took a tug and some pleasure boats and a dive boat and the Canadian Coast Guard cutter Cape Rescue to that site with a number of descendants of the crew who were lost on that vessel. And we placed, with the help of Save Ontario Shipwrecks, that copper wreath, which is about this diameter, on the stem of the Wexford wreck with the permission of the Ontario government and the people who look after things like that, as our commemoration and our remembrance for 100 years after. And it was a very moving event. And there are some slides from the activity. On the right, you can see the dive boat and John Charest, who worked his heart out to get ready for this and actually place the wreath on the wreck. If you want to see him do it live, go to our website. There's a video there. We'll show him diving with that wreath and placing it on the stem of the Wexford. In the center, looking down on family and committee members, on the top left, the president of the, I guess it would be vice president of the Ontario section of Save Ontario Shipwrecks, and her husband on the left. But in the middle, this guy right here, would you stand up, Robert? Who happens to be Robert Orrin Gordon, the great nephew of the 16-year-old Orrin Gordon, who was the wheelsman on board. That's good. Thank you, Robert. Who has become a close, long-distance friend as we have come through this ever since the publication of the book a few years ago. And also hiding there, right here, I lost my laser pen. Still haven't found it. Julie. Oh, no, I'm sorry, I got the wrong. Chris. That's Mrs. I'm sorry, just my head was on descendants. And I know there are other descendants of victims on the wreck here. Where are you hiding? Put your hands up. Here's one. Which crew member?
When my son told me about it last week, I didn't even know we had lost a member.
That's pretty recent.
Yeah.
Well, and who else? That was Scott, right?
I think so.
Okay. And somewhere back here, was there? Yes?
Yeah, actually, Brooks was my husband's uncle. He was first lady.
Okay, great. And because we haven't talked to you yet, and because it's not October the 20th yet, if you can get in touch with, and don't leave this room without me giving you the information, Kathleen Pletch on our committee, you can get your story into our next book, which is called Dear Ella, and there's a reason for the name I won't go into now, but we are gathering stories from families of descendants of victims on the wreck to see what they know and what has been passed down through their families. And we'll have the story of the Gordons and the story of the Camerons, Bruce Cameron, the captain, and others who have been contacted, not just from the Wexford, but from other victims of the storm. The person who's doing this happens to be, by coincidence, the great niece of Captain Dancing Jimmy Owen, who went down on the Smith. Anyway, the book will be a collection of photographs that have been released by those family members and their own personal stories as have never been told before. We hope to have the book finished together and published the last week of October. You can read about it on our website or our Facebook page. Anyway, I needed to share that with you. We're also building a permanent memorial. If you know Goderich, you know Goderich had a pretty bad storm a couple of years ago. Well, the stone on the base of our memorial comes from the Victoria Street United Church that was built in 1878 and destroyed in that storm. Just happens to be the same church that was attended by families of victims on the Wexford who went down in that storm. The ship, as you can see it on the top, the impression of a ship being tossed in the waves has been created by a local blacksmith, and that's not the finished product at all. It looks like bronze now that has been completed, and it is going to be unveiled officially on November the 8th at 9 a.m. during our opening ceremonies, which will take place at the very spot The 50-year plaque was unveiled in the 1960s, I guess it was. The reason Goderich, I need to clarify, is because Goderich was the headquarters of the recovery and the investigatory proceedings after the storm, because it was the central shipping port on Lake Huron, and of course Lake Huron was the place where most of the damage and loss occurred. I need to talk briefly about books. Sometimes I do books for Dundurn and Natural Heritage, Natural History. Sometimes. They don't like me doing other books. These are some of the books that I have written, not to be talked about tonight. They're all by Dundurn. The one in the middle I did bring tonight. It's the story of a young naval lieutenant who spent the end of his 4 years on the Great Lakes in 1814-15, at the end of the War of 1812, over in Wasaga Beach, not Wasaga, running the supply routes between there and Mackinac Island, and also helping Captain Owen do survey work on the entrance to Georgian Bay and down past Collingwood and over to Nottawasaga and the Penetang area. That book is here, the Wexford book is here. You might wonder why I brought the tiger with me. I don't know whether you've ever heard of Tiger Dunlop, but he was an Army surgeon who was first here in the War of 1812. The stories we hear about him are from the Canada Company and in the 1830s and 40s and 50s. But he was here for 2 or 3 years with the Army, the British Army, in the War of 1812. And he and David Wingfield, on the previous screen in the middle there, crossed paths over here in Kentonfelt Bay. And they both wrote journals about their time here in the war. And it's amazing to read both of them together and make comparisons from the Army perspective and from the Navy perspective, because both books contain the stories as they have written them, and I have annotated them and explained them and tried to translate some of it into modern day, more understandable English. I don't write for an academic audience, by the way, I write for you. And I have written with a 95-year-old partner popular histories that are factually accurate, we believe, but for you, not for those who attend university or are in true academic circles. The storm. In its simplest form, the Great Lakes storm of 1913 was a collision of a number of storms. Depending on who you listen to, you'll get different versions of that story. I can take those back now. But essentially, there was stuff came from the south, and there was stuff came from the west, and there was stuff came from the north. And it all hit over the Great Lakes. It stayed there for 3 days, in fact 4 days if you count where it was over the northeastern United States, because it was held in place largely by a high pressure system over the Atlantic and initially over the northeastern states. That was the detailed weather map that was produced by the Ministry of Agriculture, or I guess it was the Department of Agriculture in the United States on November the 8th, I believe it was. And it shows the Colorado low coming in from there. It shows the low pressure area that was coming up from the Caribbean on the Gulf Coast of Florida and connected with this thing that came up the Mississippi Valley. And as all American weather maps are, there's no weather in Canada, so it doesn't show you anything coming from the north. But indeed, you need to add the Alberta Clipper, and you need to add the Arctic low that was sweeping down from the Northwest Territories, but they're not on that map. Let me see where we go here. Okay. The best modern day comparison that I can offer you is Hurricane Sandy. If you think back to what happened there with the storms coming up the Atlantic coast of Florida from the Caribbean and meeting the Arctic low that came down from our part of the country and the stuff that came in from the west, the midwestern United States, and colliding over the northeastern United States as a hurricane or indeed a tropical storm at that point. And if you recall the horrendous damage that occurred there, all you have to do is move it 300 miles inland and you've got what happened essentially in the Great Lakes storm of 1913. The problems came up the Gulf Coast of the United States and up the Mississippi Valley as opposed to coming up offshore on the Atlantic. It's not an exact comparison because some would argue that it wasn't a hurricane that happened here. It was indeed almost, but not quite, but that's a debatable point. And the system, as it developed over November the 8th and November the 9th and November the 10th, just stayed there. And it got more intense and more intense and more intense. And the isobars that you can see here, centered over Lake Huron, show the very high-speed winds. And in fact, as the system passed through, the waves built up to horrendous proportions from the north to the south. It was one of those rare occasions when on the Great Lakes, when on Lake Huron, the wind blew north to south, not northwest, northeast, or from one of the other two directions, southeast, southwest. There was no place to hide, and there was no place to stop the waves from building up. And then all of a sudden, as the center of the system passed through, and people thought in this eye of the storm that there was a lull, and suddenly got courage to go on the lake, all hell broke loose, and the wind came from the other direction. And you had the waves coming this way, and the wind going that way. And what an awful time it created. And if you were going to then make the comparison, as I suggested, all you need to do is move Hurricane Sandy inland and put it over the Great Lakes. And it gives you a sense of what happened. And you know what happened in Hurricane Sandy. What we haven't done a very good job of is recounting what happened on land in the Great Lakes storm of 1913. Most of the accounts of Hurricane Sandy talk about what happened on land and not on the sea. And what we talk about in Ontario, particularly, and in Canada, is what happened on the lakes, not what happened on the land, because most of the carnage and the losses were on the lakes. But there was horrendous loss on the land. If you want to play with the 1913 storm, there is a NOAA, N-O-A-A website from Detroit and Cleveland that allows you to play with the wave heights, the wind directions, the wind speed, and all that stuff. They have modeled a computer model of the 1913 storm, and you can analyze it yourself by going to this animated website. Now, there were storms a lot. It wasn't just this one. And I'm not going to go into the detail here, but there was horrendous loss of life over the period of time that history was recorded on the Great Lakes. And there were bad storms. And there was a lot of life loss. But there was never anything like this tragedy. This was the worst in terms of the number of ships, and it was the worst in terms of the extent of the storm, and it was the worst in terms of how long it lasted. This shipwreck map, which isn't particularly accurate, by the way, represents, if you can see the little black dots, where the losses occurred. And if you look at Lake Huron in particular, that's where most of them happened. Now, I'm going to try and talk you through a few minutes of what happened on Lake Huron, if this will work for me. Someone was going to help me with the volume here if I needed to change it. These paintings were done by Bud Robinson, who did the marine painting of the Wexford. And this is what happened on Lake Huron, just Lake Huron. And in the storm, there were 8 ships that went down, 14 altogether on the Great Lakes, but on Lake Huron alone, 8. And another great number were constructive total losses. So, first of all, looking at Lake Superior, we lost the Henry B. Smith, which was just found in June. The same day we sent our book to the printers, and because of my connection with the Wexford, the diver sent us colored pictures which we were able to put into the book before it went to press. The Leafield went down, another British steamer carrying steel rails, never been found at all at this time. On Lake Michigan, there were lesser challenges, but the damages were just as severe. This barge, the Plymouth, was lost, and 7 seamen were lost on that vessel. On Lake Huron, we had so many. Charles Price is probably the one most people know about because it floated upside down for days after the storm and nobody quite was. The Wexford, of course, we know it in Collingwood, especially, and in Godrich. Those 2 ports were among its favorites. And there she is steaming. 23 or 24 persons lost when it went down off St. Louis. And of course the Carruthers, the mighty Leviathan of the Lakes, just built in May of 1913, launched here in Collingwood and sent off on its 3rd or 4th voyage. It was gone. Never been found today at all. Lost on this ship. I'm not sure which one. I think it's a Regina. Yeah. And a tremendous story. Off Lexington, the ship tried to anchor. Anchors broke loose, and ultimately the captain and crew perished and the ship went down. 25 were lost. Many of the relics are in the Huron County Museum. And 10 more boxes of artifacts are going to be returned to Canada from Detroit if we can find someone to take them. Imagine if we can find someone to take them. Can somebody turn that down a little bit back there? Just the little button on the Argus went down off the thumb of Michigan, and all crew members were lost. She was found in the 1970s. That's good, thanks. In the 1970s, Isaac Scott went down off Thunder Bay Island near Alpena. We don't know a lot about it. It was found in the 1970s. The steamer Hydrus was lost in the deep waters of Lake Huron, north of Point Clark. It has never been found, although they found relics and things thrown up on shore, including this lifeboat. On Lake Erie, there were losses, but not as significant, because the storm wasn't quite as horrendous there. The lightship at Buffalo went down. This one, I believe, is probably the one that was guarding the Corsica Shoals at the entrance to the St. John River, pardon me. And there was another one went down at Buffalo. Okay, we'll go back to something less dramatic. I wanted to share you with that because Bud had worked so hard to put it together. Am I blocking you? Okay. So, in total, 12 ships went down. And they were these. I'm not going to go over them again. But you need to understand how many ships were lost, and all of the crew perished on these ships. In all, somewhere between 266 and 300 men and women did not survive. About 60 bodies were recovered. The rest have never been found. We're going through the process right now of locating grave sites for unnamed sailors and placing plaques on them for this 100th year commemoration. We have 2 near where I live, one at Kintail, the little hamlet by Kingsbridge north of town, and there's another one where there's been a sailor buried in the I don't know the correct name for it, the paupers section of the Clinton Cemetery. A young man who was here in Canada for 6 weeks who took up residence in a boarding house there, and we're putting a marker on that grave too. The mayor and council of a little community near Kamlaki are doing the same thing to honor the memory of a sailor who was found buried but never named, and as one of our friends in Oliphant would say, was known only to God. And that's the kind of marker. But, there were 11 ships stranded on Lake Superior and Lake Michigan. Those are their names. And those are the ships. And they were not just freighters or lakers. There were passenger ships and other types of vessels as well. One of the most horrible stories that I hate to even think about is the barge Halstead. I think that might be it at the bottom. And it was being towed through Lake Michigan during the storm by a tug. The tug cut the lines and ran for shelter. The Halstead was swept ashore. I don't think there was any loss of life because it did get washed up on the beach. It was a wooden ship. There were 10 stranded on Lake Huron in addition to the 8 that sank. The Hogwood, steered ashore by Edward Kanabe, defying his captain's orders to take the boat into deep water, brought that boat up on the beach just north of Port Edward and almost ran into the front deck of the Huron Hotel. Quite a surprise for them the next morning. And these are the ships that were stranded on other parts of Lake Huron. I believe there were 19 ships in the list that were total constructive losses, some of which actually did get rebuilt, but for the most part they were just written off. And on Lake Erie there were 6 more stranded or damaged severely. And in one case, a number of steamship barges, I don't have any pictures to share with you of those, were all battered to heck inside the breakwalls at Cleveland Harbor in the outer harbor. And these are some of those ships. Now, most of the historical records will add 2 more ships that were lost in the storm on Lake Erie, but they're wrong. They weren't. One of them went in August, and the other one went in October. Won't go into that now, but that's part of the correction that needs to be made to the longer-term history. The Alfiki and the barge Donaldson are the 2 names of the ships that shouldn't be on the list. But it wasn't just the 40 that I showed you. There were countless others that were damaged or lost. And we didn't put them into the official record because nobody took the time to go through the local portside newspapers and gather up the information and the evidence. And here's one of them, for example, that wasn't lost, but was stranded. The great 3-masted schooner, the Seffi, built on the little shipyards called the Marlton shipyards in the back end of Goderich Harbor, and was thrown up in a location like she was there one stormy afternoon off the shores of Kincardine. Go through that. So, the big thing is we lost ships, sure, but we lost lives. And the impact of losing lives was such that it would have an impact for wives who became widows and their sons and daughters and brothers and sisters and moms and dads and other members of their families, not only for the current generation, but for generations to follow, because it changed their whole way of life. They had no breadwinners, and the sad thing was there were no pensions, and there was no workers' compensation. And most of the money that was paid to help get widows and their families through was collected through public donations. Very soon afterwards, workers' compensation was introduced in Ontario. Very soon afterwards, the shipping companies were required to provide pensions, and not on a voluntary basis, pensions and insurance and that sort of thing. I mentioned briefly landside impacts. I don't know whether you can see the line where the red arrow is pointing or not. This was written by an old fellow who used to correspond with me 15 years ago. Maybe it was 20, I'm not sure. I can't find him anymore. I presume he's now deceased. I tried to locate him when I was finishing this current book, but because I wanted to talk to him. But he wrote me that, I'll just read that sentence. Behind them, they left 75% of the standing pine of Georgian Bay and Lake Superior uprooted. So that you need to imagine the extent of damage that occurred in the natural virgin forested areas of the lakes, north of Superior all the way through to southern Georgian Bay, inland, I think, from here towards Algonquin Park and south towards Barrie and beyond. I don't have a lot of pictures of that sort of thing, but here is one Ontario roadside after the storm. There was tremendous snow, as much as 2 meters in some places, can you imagine? And not just ordinary cold winter snow, but the kind of snow that's that wet, yucky snowball snow, the snowman building snow that the kids love, everywhere. And you couldn't move cars, if there were cars around to move. You couldn't move horses and wagons. You couldn't move trains. And you had no way of getting around. And that was all the way from north of Superior to east of Cleveland in Ohio. It was quite remarkable. There's the railway sheds, a roundhouse at Southampton after the storm. And it's, as I said, it's been difficult getting pictures. That's somewhere in the US in Ohio. I'm not sure exactly where. The city of Ohio, or the city of Cleveland hired teams of men to shovel the snow so they could get the snow out of the road, so they could get the electricity and the telegraph people in to clean up the wires and make sure people weren't going to get killed because of the damage from the stuff that had come down. And it took days. There's the barge that got abandoned and cut loose and came ashore. And just a mile away from that, another ship on Lake Michigan came ashore. I think it was called the Louisiana. And as it hit the beaches and rolled, its boilers broke. No, it wasn't boilers. Its furnaces broke open and spilled live coals and everything in the engine room. The ship caught fire and was gutted. And fortunately, they were able to get the crew off and save them. But the ship was totally destroyed. There's a railway line that was knocked in. This ship missed the entrance to Cleveland Harbor by 1,000 feet. Ended up on the beach. It was called the Grammar. And of course, after any great tragedy, there's always the blame placing. Everybody was at fault. The captains were at fault. They shouldn't have taken the ships out. The lighthouses were no good. The harbors were no good. The ships were underpowered, especially the ones built in Collingwood. And there were all kinds of things going on. If you want a little bit of a giggle about it, read the inquest notes, which we haven't yet posted on our website. The life-saving instructions and the life-saving stations around the lakes were inadequate and insufficient. I don't know what they expected. Here's a picture of a breeches buoy. There are detailed instructions on how to get that device, which is like a pair of pants with its legs cut off, between the shore and a ship close to the shore, and how to put somebody in it, like you can see there, so they could come off and be rescued on shore. And all of those detailed instructions are just amazing if you read back and go through them. But they got blamed for being inadequate. The fact is the storm was just too overwhelming, and there was no way to deal with it. The reality is the weather did come to a lull. It looked like the weather was going to change, and at that time there were a lot of ships holed up in the St. Clair River and a lot of ships holed up south of the Sioux Locks, having come off stormy conditions in Lake Superior and getting ready to enter Lake Huron, and they just waited because the weather was bad. And the captains and the first mates and the engineers decided in conversation that the weather looked like it was going to be okay. The barometer was on the way up again, so that storm was over. It had been balmy the day before. Farmers were in the fields harvesting. Folks were in their gardens bringing in pumpkins and things like that. The fall fruits were being picked off the trees. It was just amazing. I mentioned the pension issue. Won't go back to it. Lake Huron. The arrow shows where I live. I was going to add another arrow to show where you are. Most of the damage was on Lake Huron, and the losses were on Lake Huron proper, but there was still stuff that happened in Georgian Bay. I may not have the ship name right. I mean, I am in my 70th year. I'm entitled to forget one. The Jenks, I believe, went aground on its way into Midland and was the main casualty on Georgian Bay and suffered $25,000 or $30,000 damage and loss of part of its cargo. That was a lot of money in those days, of course. I saw a photograph in the current edition of your tourism magazine that was just out today. What was it called? Mountain Life? I don't remember the name of it. Is that what it is? Hurricane Sandy on Georgian Bay. Wow, what a fantastic picture. I need to contact the photographer and see if I can get it into my slides. We'll deal with that. The Wexford tried to get into Goderich Harbor. Goderich Harbor used to look like this, and they changed it. See where it says new entrance towards the top? Because they kept having damage from ice coming down the river and from the sandbars building up outside the old entrance where the letters are H-U-R in the word Lake Huron. So they rebuilt the harbor to look like that. And those two break balls to your left, however they were configured, which isn't very good, is what the Wexford tried to get through when she was trying to enter in the afternoon of November the 9th, when she made her way south from the safety of the anchorage that Bruce Cameron, the captain, decided to leave. The old harbor I showed you in the original river mouth is outlined in red. Goderich, of course, is now a great commercial port. It was the largest commercial port in the lower lakes. Not the lower lakes, because Lake Huron is an upper lake. But it was the busiest, and it carried the most traffic and cargo of all of the ports on the lakes, other than Fort William, I think, and perhaps one of the American ports, and I don't know which one. Cleveland was busy, but not so much for cargo. But Goderich was it at the time. And of course, it stayed as a commercial harbor today with its salt mines, now the largest in the world, and runs year-round. Because of climate change, I would say, and others would agree, although not everyone would. And it's a very busy port. But the interesting thing is, look at the ship in the background. On a windy day now, waiting to get into Goderich Harbor, couldn't. And that wasn't a storm. And the Wexford was trying to get in the vicious storm that I described earlier. Captain Cameron deserves a tremendous amount of credit. He had the wisdom at age 24, 3 weeks on the job with 10 years experience, to anchor his ship in Hay Lake, now called Lake Nicollet, south of the St. Mary's River, because he knew something wasn't quite right. And he felt for the safety of his ship and his crew, he would stay there and wait until he knew that things were right. And I'm sure he conferred with his wheelsman, Orrin Gordon, and the other members of his crew, the first mate, and other officers and regular crew about what they might do. And they decided to anchor. But then, as the lull occurred and the barometer started to come up, there got to be a parade going by. The Carruthers went by, and other ships with old, seasoned captains on them went by. And they would look in, and they would see the Wexford tucked safely away, with the young man who was the new captain, probably too afraid to come out and face the water on Lake Huron. So ultimately, Bruce Cameron decided, well, if they are going, and if they might be thinking what I think they're thinking, that's what I would have said. He hauled anchor, he weighed anchor, and off they went and joined the parade. Now I know that's what a young captain thinks, because my uncle, my late uncle, 85-year-old Captain Albert Roy Mundy, who was a master on the lakes for 35 years, did exactly the same thing in exactly the same lake when he was a young man. And he joined the parade of other boats that went by when the weather didn't feel quite right. And he was sleeping, I recall, as he told the story. And his first mate kept coming say, Cap, don't you think we should leave? There goes another one. Cap, don't you think we should go? There goes another one. And they did. They hauled anchor, and they went, and they were into the most horrendous storm, one of the ones that Uncle Roy remembered forever until his dying day, and in the last 2 years of his life when he told me that story as I was writing this book. And it helped me have a better appreciation for what must have been going on in the mind of that young man, Bruce Cameron. Well, we better get to the Wexford in Collingwood sometime here, don't you think? That was her in Collingwood, and I'll come back to that picture in a minute. That was the first picture that was, it isn't the earliest picture of the Wexford, but it was the first really good picture, and I think the only picture in existence that shows the nature of the beast before she was converted from an ocean packet freighter to a bulk cargo lake carrier. And I'll tell you how that was done here in the Collingwood shipyards in a minute. She was built in the northeast of England in Sunderland. If I had my pointer, I'd be pointing it up there near Newcastle in the northeast, which was a great shipbuilding capital for England. In fact, she was built on that river just by the bridge you can see crossing the river partway through the picture, halfway down. Right in that building were the very first plates of metal fastened together that were moved out to that outer structure, and she was built out there in that framework, under that framework that you could see, and then launched into the river. I've been trying to remember the name of the river for the last 3 or 4 presentations, but it hasn't come out yet. It's in there somewhere. Did you know, get this right here, there she is in her early days on the Great Lakes. She had been converted. I'm looking at the anchors, because the anchors will tell you whether she'd been converted. But she was still carrying 2 large booms on each mast upright, because on the oceans she used to sail. And she carried a full set of gaff rig sails to assist her in the ocean crossings. And I don't have time to talk about that, and I don't have time to talk about the way she was changed in detail. I'll buzz by it quickly. There she is in Collingwood here, December the 9th, 06, in a picture that you can find in a dozen different places. I had it come to me from 3 different sources for the book and picked the best image, and that was one of them. There she is in Collingwood again, with her stern at the outer end of the dry docks, having bottom plates. The Wexford spent a lot of time here getting repaired. Seems her captains like to go aground and tear the bottom plates out. Talk a little bit about that in a minute. There she is again at an unnamed port. We call her elusive because when she went down, she couldn't be found, like the Carruthers and the Hydras has continued to elude us. And the interesting thing was, in the Evening Free Press, the London Evening Free Press of November the 13th or 14th, 1913, she was reported to have sunk somewhere off St. Joseph. And then someone decided that the upside-down ship, the mystery ship, was the Wexford because of the color of the bottom paint, until somebody recognized that that wasn't the same color as the bottom paint on the Wexford. And then she was supposedly discovered off the beaches somewhere near Point Edward. And then, and finally where the yellow triangle is in the year 2000, in late August, she was discovered, and the divers went down and confirmed that this in fact was the resting place of the Wexford, where she actually went to the bottom, not very far from where the Free Press reported her to be in the evening reports from mid-November 1913. Let's see here. When she was first launched, upper left, she was a well-decked ship. She had a raised bow and a raised stern, and her bulwarks in the middle were low. That was 1883. She had 1 season on the water and went back into the yards in Sunderland to be rebuilt because she didn't carry water well for some reason. I don't know why, I've never been able to find that out. But they built a new deck here called a spar deck, 6 or 8 feet from the original deck, and then a new set of cargo hatches and so on. She could carry more cargo in that space. She could carry more coal as a result, and she behaved differently on the water. Unfortunately for her, in her final moments, the spar deck and its collapse near the bow, in my opinion, played a role in her foundering. Otherwise, she might have stayed afloat. Well, I don't think she could have stayed afloat. There are several reasons for that. When she came to the Great Lakes and was altered in Collingwood, drawing number 3, they reduced her bunker space for coal and added cargo space and made some other changes. Here's what happened here. They took away the old fisherman type anchors that hung over the bow and the chains came over the top and replaced them with the typical anchors that you would see on the Lakers today. Same style, 2 of them. They took away 2 of the lifeboat stations, the second Red Arrow. They only needed 2, a pair of them on the lakes. It wouldn't have made any difference in this storm anyway. New boilers, new engine, and they played with the stack. I don't know why, but this ship had trouble with its stack. Held up by cables, if you can see them. And there may be a postcard later on that shows her wintering here in Collingwood again without a stack. But that thing played havoc with them because it bounced around, it seemed. And it too was a factor in her foundering. What else did they do? Oh, they changed her boom and her mass and her boom so they could be used for carrying deck cargo if that were ever required. And here she is, do I have an arrow there? Yep. Way back in the dry docks in 1913, in January, note the date, she was having bottom repairs. And there she is in August of 1913. She was having bottom repairs. I hope there are no platers in the room. Are there any platers in the room? P-L-A-Y-T-E-R-S. Captain Plater, who was the captain, had a bad habit of going aground. And in this particular grounding, he took out, I think it was 26 plates, and lost thousands of bushels of grain somewhere up in the St. Mary's River area after coming through the Sioux Locks. And no, it wasn't Oren steering her. The captain was giving the orders. And anyway, then there's another story about her in contact with the other boat, but I don't know what that one is, and we don't have time for it. Anyway, I wrote the book. I had to write the book. It was something that's been with me since I was a child. When I was 9 years old, I worked on the commercial fishing tug called the Larry John with a buddy of mine named Larry Atfield, who's now gone. And we both got to run the boat. Not because we were 9 and 10 years old, but because we did it right. The big guys, the old guys, had other jobs to do. I could steer the tugboat straight, so I got to steer. And I got to steer also because I could see the best, and I could find the little fishing buoys. And one day we went over this horrible big thing on the sonar. In those days you had the old bottom sounders that told you not only the depth, but they spit it out on a long roll of paper, and they burned it in black on the paper. And we went over something that went like this. And we both asked Abby what it was. And he said, it's a shipwreck. We can't put our nets here because they'll just get tangled and we'll never get them back. And you know what? It was southwest of Goderich. And you know what? It was about 15 to 17 miles southwest of Goderich. And I know to this day that was my first contact with the Wexford. I don't want to tell you about that. I won an award for the book. Happy about that. This man, Bud Robinson, has been so kind in sharing his work. He needs to have a lot of credit. His family goes back for generations. His great-granddaddy was the lightkeeper at the Goderich Lighthouse. You can just barely see in the back right-hand corner here at the time that the Wexford was trying to make harbor. And that's his painting called Last Sighting. That's Bud. He wants me to use that picture, not the one with less hair and it's all turned white. The Wexford was a romantic boat, and she was loved by people in Collingwood and in, I was going to say Thunder Bay, in Fort William and in Goderich for several reasons. The bow was flared and just kind of lifted her up. You can see the new anchors there. The cuddy cabin at the front is where the crew entered their quarters, next to the anchor locker. That's the grunt crew. But they would peek out of there as she was coming in and out of harbor if they weren't needed on deck, because they wanted to see all the young women who were waving back at them as they came and went. And the captain and the officers were in the center midship section. And often at the hurricane deck up above, as it was called, there was a canvas over the top to keep the sun off and to keep the breezes down. And then, of course, the fact that she was a midships vessel, an ocean salty, and her very design was so different than those with fore and aft structure, and that made her a pretty ship to look at. And the cook would often wave from the galley at the stern. See the little stack back there? And that's where the engineer and the cook and the steward, George and Grace Wilmot, on this voyage, on their last trip ever, because when it was over they were going home to England to retire. That's where they hung out, at the back. And then if you can catch it, the open emergency steering wheel at the very stern. So it was a pretty boat. And of course her two masts and the running rigging on them just made her very special. Here she is in Collingwood again, because she often wintered here, and it's a great shot showing her from above. And I won't read this stuff to you. Normally I would quit now and put some music on and sit down, but I see in my mad flurry I brought the wrong CD. But I might just talk my way through here a bit and see if I can't find you a piece of music that I think you should listen to while we look at some slides. I have a friend who's the chair of our committee who wrote 10 songs to commemorate the Great Storm. His name is David McAdam, and he is a descendant of 2 of the victims who were lost on the ship. Let's see, that's number 11 I'm looking for. And he wrote these songs because he wanted to do his thing to commemorate the storm as well. This one's called All Hands, I hope. Can you hear that back there?
At 0125, such a sea did strike. It silenced the ship's bell and chime. It stopped all hands, the hands of man, even the hands of time. The only hands that could not touch the sea of shock and awe were those of its maker, the hands of the Creator, the powerful hands of God. And into these hands flow the souls of man, the spirit of ship and crew. Out of the storm, fear no more, your home, your soul's renewed. All the ship's souls was this tempest's toll, only legend lived to tell. The rage would come, cold and deep, as all hands joined the silenced bell. Mystic it was that brought these souls together in time and space. Into his hands, his holy plan, into his harbor safe. And into these hands for the souls of man, the spirit of ship and crew. Out of the storm, fear no more, your home, your soul's renewed.
June 1913, crew member to his lady friend. I hope she's not like this in the fall.
Our loved ones gone from this place shall never be in out of the storm. Fear no more, your home, your soul's renewed. I am the son of a mother who died young. My father passed on when I was 21. My brother and I don't speak nor do right. We fell out over pennies and pride. Fell out over pennies and pride. So I packed up me life, my sea bag and knife. Signed on to this later the very next night. In 6 months I did steer, a good captain I revered. One of those memories I'll always hold dear. Memories I'll always hold dear. This ship is me life, I haven't a wife. Nobody claims me. My family is crew on these great lakes of blue. Nobody claims me. Nobody claims me. Alas, it seems low, I've seen many a blow. But this one feels different, she's seeking my soul. Huron's beauty turns dark in this wintry churn. The lightship's long gone o'er the rail of our stern. Gone o'er the rail of our stern. This ship is me life, I haven't a wife. Nobody claims me. My family is crew on these great lakes of blue. Nobody claims me. Nobody claims me. Where does one start when your ship breaks apart? Such a sickening sight one should see. One great big sea, I'm o'er the rail. Once more my home forsakes me. It's cold, so goddamn cold. Nobody claims me. My family, my crew, I think they're all gone too. Nobody claims me. This cold turns to calm, my will is all gone. Nobody claims me. As the water slips in, my light it grows dim. Nobody claims me. Nobody claims me. Watch from above as the bodies wash up alone in the sand, shale and stone. In Godrich Town Square you might find me there, but nobody claims me. Still nobody claims me. I am the son of a mother who died young. My father passed on when I was 21.
Thank you for your attention. I'd be glad to answer some questions.